Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at the Morphy Auction Company taking a look at some of the guns they're going to be selling in their upcoming April of 2019 Premier Firearms Auction. Today we're taking a look at a Bren gun, not just any Bren gun. This is a John Inglis, so a Canadian manufactured Bren gun in 8mm Mauser. You may notice the straight-walled magazine. This was a really interesting project. Now, in total, Inglis would manufacture something like 186,000 Bren guns, and most of those were in .303 caliber. The Inglis company had existed in Toronto since about the 1860s. However, in the aftermath of World War I, where of course they did a lot of ordnance work, big metal fabrication company, they did a lot of ordnance work in World War I. But then the Great Depression kind of did them in the 1930s. All of the principal family members passed away in 35 or 36. The company went into receivership, and it was purchased about that time by a Canadian military officer, Major James Hahn, and some associates, because what they saw in this was a big manufacturing facility, a large manufacturing facility, and they knew that the Canadian Army was going to be interested in buying machine guns. Hahn was in the Army, of course. He had some inside knowledge in this, and they figured this would be a really good opportunity. And so they got together and were able to buy up the factory relatively inexpensively because no one else wanted it at the time. It wasn't actually producing anything. And they managed to get themselves, in 1938, a contract to manufacture Bren guns. And they would manufacture them first for the British and then for the Canadians, and then expand out. By the time we really got into the heat of World War II, Inglis became a massive complex. They had over 1 million square feet of covered manufacturing space. They had something like 15,000 employees. It was a huge operation. And they got an interest in 8mm Bren guns from the Chinese. Now, the nationalist Chinese were an allied power to the United States, the United Kingdom, and the other allies. And the Chinese, their standard cartridge was 8mm Mauser, and they were looking for ordnance kind of desperately. In fact, interestingly, before World War II, they had actually arranged or contracted to purchase LS-26 light machine guns from Finland in 8mm Mauser. They ordered something like 30,000 of them. Only 800 were actually delivered before supplies were cut off. But just a little background. They were very much interested in firearms. And what they ended up finding was they were able to use basically the Lend-Lease program to acquire small arms and other equipment from Canada. And this would manifest itself primarily in 2 firearms, as well as other equipment, one of them being 8mm Bren guns, and the other being high-power pistols. So the high-power pistol side is pretty well documented. The Bren gun side, much less so. What we do know is that in early 1941, the British brought in, I believe, 189 ZB-30 machine guns in 8mm Mauser. Now, the Bren gun was developed from the ZB-26, which became the ZB-30. It was designed in Czechoslovakia, and the British government was looking for a light machine gun in the 30s, and they had a trial, and one of the guns that was submitted to them was it was a ZBG 33, which is basically the ZB-26 with some updates and chambered for the .303 cartridge for the British. So they knew, and this would eventually be adopted as the Bren gun, knowing that the Bren gun evolved from the ZB-26 and ZB-30, if you want to make the Bren gun in 8mm, the natural way to go is to go back to the 8mm ancestor of the gun and use that to reverse engineer it or to redesign the Bren. So take the ZB-30 and give it the same sort of upgrade structure, that the Bren gun had gotten. And so that's exactly what they did. For that reason, the magazines that the 8mm Bren gun uses are identical to those of the ZB-26 and the ZB-30. And Inglis would manufacture hundreds of thousands of these magazines as well as the guns. So there are, in fact, 3 different versions of the 8mm Bren gun, and they differ basically just in markings. So let me go ahead and show you the markings and a couple other interesting elements to this gun, and then we'll come back and talk about what the long-term implications of this gun were. I'm going to go ahead and start with the markings here. Nice big letters right on the side, 7.92 Bren Mark I. Now, if you are familiar with the Bren guns, you are immediately going to notice the rear sight. And this is a Mark II rear sight. The Mark I guns had a rotary, a drum-style rear sight dovetailed into the side of the receiver, and one of the major changes to the Mark II pattern of the Bren was to replace that with this style of ladder sight, which flips up. So you might be wondering, why is this marked Mark I? Well, the answer is this is a Mark I 792 Bren, which is not the same thing as a Mark I 303 Bren. That's just a little detail of British nomenclature systems there. Because this was in 792, it was its own series of guns, and thus this is the Mark I version of the 792 Bren. There were, by the way, no other versions of it. Now, there are three different types of markings that can be found on 792 Brens. The guns themselves are all the same, but you have this, which is commonly referred to as the sterile type, because the only marking it has is this one here on the receiver. No, there's nowhere on there does it say who made it or when. There is a second version, which is commonly called the resistance 8mm Bren, which will also have a marking up here of Inglis and a year date, typically 43 or 44. Those are allegedly somewhere they were made to be dropped to mainland European resistance movements where 8mm Mauser ammunition was easily available. It is not well documented how much, if any, of that was ever actually done, but there are guns out there that have the date markings on as well. And then the best documented of the whole bunch are ones that actually have a long pantographed series of Chinese characters here, which basically read 7.92mm Bren gun made in Canada. And those are the ones that were made specifically under contract for Chiang Kai-shek. And a lot of those were, in fact, undoubtedly shipped to China. It took a while. It wasn't until basically mid-1945 before many of them had arrived. It took some time to figure out how to get them there. This is pretty well documented with the Inglis high powers. And I actually have a video on the Inglis high power. So if you're interested in more about the Chinese side of this story, I would recommend taking a look at that video. Now, this gun, despite being called sterile, it is in fact serialized, and it has a serial number up here on the back of the receiver, as you would expect for a 792 Bren. And in this case, the sterile, quote-unquote sterile guns, have a serial number pattern that is a single digit, and then a hyphen, and then a 4-digit number. The ones that came into the US run from approximately 15,000 through approximately 28,000, if we assume that this front digit is simply the 10,000th place, which I think makes sense. The Chinese contract ones had a CH serial number prefix, so it would be, the very first one would be 0CH0001, and when they hit 10,000, they would go from 0CH to 1CH, and then continue iterating the 4-digit number. And then the European resistance ones, quote unquote, have a T prefix serial number, and those, the T and the CH, those match with the Inglis high power serial numbers. This is also serialized down here, which is the lower assembly, and on the barrel locking lever, and on the barrel itself. So for being a sterile gun, it certainly is very nicely matching and numbered. That is it for markings, though, except for their selector settings, which have a 0 for safe, a 1 for semi-auto, and a 20 for full auto. This does use a 20-round magazine as opposed to the 303 guns, which had a 30-round magazine. The reason for that is simply to continue using the existing pattern of ZB26 and ZB30 magazines, which were 20 rounds. When they designed this gun in the 1920s, Brenau did a great job on the magazine. ZB26 magazines are high quality, reliable, and just in general, very nice. And so this was an excellent magazine to continue using. You'll find these manufactured by the Czechs. You'll find them Nazi-proofed. You'll find John Inglis ones. One of the very interesting magazines that was made by both sides of the war, kind of like the high power. Disassembly is really simple because this is a Bren gun. Just punch this pin through. There we go. Pull that out, and then our lower assembly is going to slide off. There we go. That's the lower. Then we can pull out our bolt carrier and bolt assembly. Pull off the bolt. The barrel is a quick release type. There's a button on the bottom here. Push the button, lift that up, and the barrel comes out. The bolt is not numbered, but it is marked as a 7.921 1X. I'm not entirely sure what the X indicates there. If you need to identify these without markings, the breech face, the bolt face, and the extractor of the 7.92 guns is distinctively different from the 303 ones, simply because with its rim, the 303 has a larger bolt face opening there and a different extractor. It may well be possible that Inglis was actually making Bren guns through 1947. There is very little documentation on this. A lot of this story is kind of hazy, and there are strong and well-reasoned opinions on all sides of it. However, it appears that the 8mm Bren guns were used for a number of different covert operations, ways to supply what are on one hand theoretically sterile guns, although the idea of a sterile Bren gun is kind of goofy. Like, who would, what would, if someone runs into a Bren gun and knows anything about small arms, they're immediately going to know that it comes from the UK or the Commonwealth. So what's the point of making it super sterile? I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that, and it's a valid argument in this case. However, these guns have been documented. In fact, this is one that was specifically documented as coming into the United States or being registered in the United States between 63 and 65 with connections to U.S. government-owned shell companies. And it looks like they may have been experimenting with some particular plan that they had for some of these guns, and some of them became superfluous and ended up being registered and just sold off, including this one. Now, the Chinese guns would go on to have their own interesting fate. A substantial number of the ones that were in nationalist Chinese hands, of course, fell into communist Chinese forces' possession at the conclusion of the Chinese Civil War. And a bunch of those were actually rebarreled and modified to use the 7.62 by 39mm cartridge, firing from AK magazines. And that's a really cool, interesting variation on these guns. In Britain, a bunch of the 8mm Bren guns did come back into the UK, and they were actually largely, or part of, the basis for the development of the L4 Bren gun, which is the Bren in 7.62 NATO, where, of course, a lot of the same issues, a lot of the same challenges of going from a rimmed cartridge to a rimless cartridge, like 8mm, like 7.62 NATO, those challenges would be similar, and so a lot of the developmental guns were based on 8mm Bren guns. And apparently to this day, some of the spare parts for the L4 guns, or not, I suppose, today, because they're not using it anymore, but the spare parts for the L4s included a lot of basically reworked or reused or just interchangeable 8mm parts. So these 8mm Bren guns have very poor documentation, but there are three very well understood, or very well, I want to say documented, but that's not quite the word, clearly existing three different types of variations on these guns, and they all have interesting provenance and stories surrounding them. So this one, of course, is in gorgeous, basically mint condition, and it's pretty cool. It's a very rare example of a very interesting firearm. So if you're interested in having it yourself, it is, of course, coming up for sale here at Morphy's. If you take a look at the description text, you'll find a link to ForgottenWeapons.com. From there, you can click over to the Morphy auction catalog page on this firearm, take a look at their pictures and description, and their price estimates and everything like that. If you're interested, you can place a bid for it. And thanks for watching.